Bloodborne is a horrifically beautiful game in every way imaginable.
Bloodborne
it's one of the most strikingly stylish and unforgettable
Bloodborne is one of those
iconic
games
ever been made.
Almost
In a lot of
7
ways,
years
it's a
ago,
horror game
Bloodborne
disguised
was
as an action game. But
Right off the bat, Bloodborne is not only one of my top Souls games, but one of my favorite games of all time.
You know what? I'm just gonna say it. Bloodborne has problems. I know, but hear me out. No game studio has a more dedicated fanbase than From Software, except maybe Nintendo, and no game has a more sterling reputation than the 2015 hit Bloodborne, except maybe Ocarina of Time. I know this game came out a long time ago, and what is there to be said that hasn't been beaten to death on Reddit and YouTube and in the hearts of gamers everywhere? The discourse around it is, to this day, overwhelmingly positive and mostly ignores or excuses the game's problems. So am I being deliberately controversial by making a negative video about a game everybody likes? Well, yeah, obviously. But I still think we should be able to criticize the things we love, and this is absolutely a case of a community ignoring a game's missteps in the face of the overall experience. Here's a recent Reddit poll from 9 years after the game came out. Based on user input, the biggest mechanical failing of Bloodborne is that it's exclusive to PlayStation. Runner-up given to loading screens. Obviously, the game's native platform is not a game mechanic, but that's just how much the Souls community loves this game. Many can't, or won't, see anything really wrong with it. And they're right to love it. While this video is analysis and not review, I will take a moment to acknowledge that Bloodborne is a masterpiece. A dark symphony of gothic horror atmosphere and brutal combat give it a unique tone and game feel that still hasn't been rivaled today. Compared to Dark Souls 2, which only came out the year before, Bloodborne feels like an enormous leap forward in gaming. But this isn't a review, so we're not going to talk about the incredible soundtrack or sound design, or the atmosphere, or the Lovecraftian inspirations, or how the game runs like ass, or the loading times, or that Sony has the rights to the game and has left it to rot on the PS4 instead of remastering it or just fucking porting it to PC. These are all valid considerations in a conversation about the game's quality, but that's not what I'm here to discuss. I want to highlight some of Bloodborne's conflicting design choices to broaden the conversation just a little, all these years later. We are going to talk about gameplay mechanics, and within the gameplay mechanics of Bloodborne, the game is not perfect. It has flaws, and I will prove it. Design artifacts from the Souls series were included in Bloodborne that do not harmonize with the intended experience for Bloodborne's combat. In the wake of massive success in Dark Souls 1 and 2, it may be that FromSoft wanted to keep older features in their new game to make it feel familiar to experienced players. Or maybe they correctly thought that they struck gold with the combat and were hesitant to change it too drastically. Those gameplay and design characteristics that are left over from the Souls series are mostly counterintuitive to Bloodborne's intended player experience. To define our terms for this analysis, what is the intended player experience? When I say that, I am referring to how the mechanics work to cultivate certain responses from the player. Not the tutorial, but more the invisible hand of game developers guiding the player. The most famous invisible tutorial of all time is the first thing you do in Super Mario Bros. A Goomba approaches Mario. A player cannot go back and cannot run through the Goomba. A player's only option to survive is to jump the Goomba. Often this will result in inadvertently hitting the question mark block, which will spawn a power-up mushroom which moves quickly and will often hit the player, activating Big Mario. The player has now been taught how the game's camera works, how enemies work, how jumping works, how blocks work, and how power-ups work, all in about 3 seconds of gameplay. Extremely efficient, subtle tutorializing. Although, I don't think that's a word. The Dark Souls series is regarded highly for incorporating this kind of gameplay teaching into mechanics, combat, level, and enemy design. The intended Dark Souls experience is careful, methodical play. Keeping an eye on your surroundings for advantages, traps, and secrets is the most effective way to survive the game. These are taught to the player in the first level. An enormous demon overwhelms the player, giving them almost no chance to fight back with their limited damage output. Safety can only be found by running through a door that closes behind the player, locking them into an actual tutorial. The player then runs into items that are accompanied with instructional messages, and then given skeletons to test the new equipment on. After a couple rooms to get geared up in practice, the player is then dropped back onto the enormous demon, with a head start in damage, the tools and knowledge to kill it. The ensuing fight, as well as the rest of the game, requires patience. The demon moves, attacks, and recovers very slowly, but the player's actions are similarly high commitment. A player can easily find themselves being hit if they are attacking, dodging, or healing recklessly. Blocking, attacking, dodging, and sprinting all draw from the same stamina bar, so moment-to-moment choices about defense versus offense define the flow of Dark Souls combat. Most people agree on what Dark Souls is and that it does this combat very effectively, so I'm not going to go into it much further. I wanted to speak on this briefly so that we can agree that From Software teaches players how to play their games with game mechanics. Now let's look at Bloodborne. The hot new Bloodborne experience is aggression. The game wants you to be vicious and fast and overwhelm monsters with your bloodlust. Combat mechanics and enemy design have been modified from Dark Souls to emphasize this. Mostly gone are the shields, and the one that is present has flavor text that calls you a pussy for using it. Enemies attack much faster than in Dark Souls 1 and 2, with less predictable timing and quicker animations. Players also have faster movement, with lower commitments for attacks, dodges, heals, and parries. The locked-on version of rolling is now a quick step, which effectively closes distance so you can attack more often, while doubling as an evasive option. The parrying is now a gun, so you can shoot enemies to stun them, giving you a short window to reach into their tummies and borrow some of their insides.
This video is not meant for children.
It's well accepted that this is the intended Bloodborne experience, and no single mechanic drives this demand for player aggression better than the rally system. Rallying allows a player to regain lost health for 5 seconds after taking damage by landing attacks on enemies. The best way to maintain your health pool is no longer to back off and heal, but to hit monsters more quickly and precisely than they can hit you. This single gameplay feature is the secret sauce that ties the combat together. By making aggression the most effective playstyle, Bloodborne funnels players into how it wants them to experience combat. We could talk about the genius of this mechanic all day, but that's not what this video is about. This video is about the things FromSoft didn't change. You may have noticed that those features I listed are all new or modified from previous iterations of FromSoft third-person melee combat. The gameplay features and mechanics that were left in Bloodborne that were unchanged from Dark Souls 1 and 2 do not promote aggression in the player. We are starting here by establishing the intended experience so that we have criteria for what motivates mechanics in this or in any game. I won't be using language like good or bad or fun to describe Bloodborne because this isn't a review. I will be demonstrating how certain mechanics in Bloodborne are counter to how the game is trying to influence play, and those are the ones that constitute problems in design. I'll cover the most significant of these one at a time, but first, a disclaimer.
Oh, yeah. Pale blood.
I will be disregarding all points about thematic or narrative significance. Partly because this analysis isn't about story or theme, but also lore reasons should not be a stand-in or excuse for gameplay in any game. Games are not movies. Lore should work for the mechanics, not the other way around. This might be a controversial perspective from which to view gameplay, but one that I firmly believe in when analyzing mechanical functionality. There are not pipes in the Mario games because Mario is a plumber. There are pathways between and through levels that reward player curiosity and allow experienced players to skip levels once they know the shortcuts. These pathways are shaped like pipes because Mario is a plumber, or maybe vice versa, but they do not exist because of the character's job in the lore. Do you see what I'm saying? Bloodborne does not promote aggression because it is about a hunter in a dream. The setting is in service of aggressive gameplay, not the other way around. I will not be cutting game mechanics any slack for being nice to look at or being thematically appropriate, true as it may be. There is a tendency for discussion around From Software's body of work to rely on theme or narrative to justify gameplay, boss design, or mechanics. Given the highly diegetic nature of these games, there are valid points to be made about how much lore significance affected mechanical design, but these can only be confirmed by Michael Zaki himself. I'm not saying these things don't matter, only that this analysis is not concerned with aesthetics, and such elements are more applicable in a broader conversation about the quality of the art. The first feature we'll discuss is the player progression and upgrade system, commonly referred to as RPG mechanics. RPG mechanics are presented in this game similarly to Dark Souls 1 and 2. Killing enemies gives the player a currency that can be used for leveling your character's stats, purchasing health vials, parry bullets, weapons, outfits, early game weapon upgrade materials, repairing weapons, or various consumables. Currency in conjunction with other, less common materials are required to upgrade weapons and unlock chalice dungeons. These actions can only be taken at a hub area that is disconnected from the main game, called the Hunter's Dream. It's disconnected because you can't walk to the dream from anywhere else in the game. You have to fast travel to and from, although I'm not sure that phrase should apply given how long it takes. This one-stop shop for all your out-of-combat preparation needs is an idea carried over from Dark Souls 2. Dark Souls 2 had this concept in Majula, a hub area that players were required to travel to frequently. It wasn't disconnected like the dream, but it functions in a similar way. In Dark Souls, you could level up from anywhere. Firelink Shrine was a central location in the world, but not one that you had to travel to for leveling up or upgrading weapons. In Bloodborne, like in Dark Souls 2, engaging with the RPG mechanics creates a break in the flow of progressing through levels by requiring the player revisit a hub whenever they want to spend currency. Also, I'm aware that a similar system exists in Demon Souls, but I'm not as familiar with that game, so I'm not going to speak about it. While travel time doesn't explicitly conflict with the combat, it does add steps to an action that most players will be doing frequently. Fast traveling can only be done at checkpoints, but in-level checkpoints can only take you back to the dream. You can't warp between checkpoints like you could in Dark Souls 2 or after acquiring the warp ability in Dark Souls 1. You can warp back to your last checkpoint, like how the Dark Sign works, but at the cost of all your held currency, so this is a limited use case and isn't a function that allows you to engage with the RPG mechanics. The disconnected nature of the Hunter's Dream, combined with the limited warping, lengthens your time to get back into combat whenever you choose to level up or upgrade weapons or switch locations. In practice, this means that to level up in Bloodborne, players must either return to their last checkpoint or forge ahead to the next one, travel to the hub area, spend their currency, open a gravestone menu designating the different sections of the game, select their desired checkpoint, and then warp there. This is, at minimum, 2 loading screens and 2 menu navigations to level up your character and get back into the game, provided you only wanted to level up and nothing else. This time investment is probably why players said that this was the second biggest problem in the game. Again, this is not a review, so I won't complain that the loading times are quite long. At this point, it's more Sony's fault than anyone else's, and I adore that the campaign for a Bloodborne PC port is very much alive today. The time it takes to engage with the leveling does not conflict with the combat, but the RPG elements do. The other thing that role-playing games and rocket-propelled grenades have in common is that they're both tools that allow users to dictate how they want to engage in combat. Fundamentally, RPG mechanics give players choice. In Dark Souls 1 and 2, this manifests in build variety. A Dex user will be able to use faster weapons that typically do less damage, lower risk, lower reward. A Strength build will be able to use heavier, slower weapons that do more damage, but have higher commitment attack animations. Higher risk, higher reward. Magic requires large stat investments to use, but has the benefit of range against a game built around melee combat. Low risk, high reward. I didn't say it was balanced. Within the framework of just these 3 archetypes, there are many possible combinations and builds that are all viable in the Souls series. Bloodborne has some variety, but not in the same way. Almost every weapon in Bloodborne has 2 modes, a faster version that does less damage, and a heavier version that does more but attacks slower. What this does is give every player with any stat investment the option to use multiple attack patterns with almost every weapon. On paper, this would grant a player wider variety in weapon selection. But, like in Dark Souls, weapons have stat requirements. There are enough weapon upgrade materials in the game to fully upgrade 5 weapons, if you include the DLC and don't buy materials from the shop in the endgame, which is only meaningfully applicable to New Game Plus runs in the DLC if you did it last. The weapons being multifunctional is Bloodborne's version of player choice in combat, giving players the option of switching up their attack patterns on the fly. Stat requirements limits player choice of weapons to those that they are leveled to use. This mechanic conflicts with the combat of Bloodborne because Bloodborne combat doesn't have multiple playstyles. In Bloodborne, you are intended to be fast and aggressive, like we established earlier. Unlike in Dark Souls, the shields suck, the ranged weapons don't do much damage, strength and dex weapons attack with similar timing, there's no more equipment load, so every player moves and dodges at top speed. Armor and clothing are purely cosmetic, no longer requiring a choice between faster movement or higher defense. In Dark Souls, these were elements that required players to choose how they wanted to engage with the combat, and it deeply affected the moment-to-moment risk versus reward choices I spoke about earlier. In Bloodborne, player choice has been whittled down to which of two attack modes should be used, and when should one parry or dodge. All of the weapons in the game are tailored to this with their varied movesets. But because the weapons provide almost all possible playstyle variety, outside of niche builds like bullet-only or magic-only challenge runs, there is no reason why a player shouldn't be allowed to wield any weapon in the game. The leveling system in Dark Souls gives players choices. In Bloodborne, it takes choices away. As an aside, there are 7 offensive spells in the game, but they aren't core combat mechanics. No spells are given to you for free at the start of the game the way guns and trick weapons are. This is probably for the best, since spells don't encourage aggressive play, and a player has to go out of their way to use spells as their primary damage output. These are questionable inclusions in the game at all, but spells don't have large potential to damage the intended experience, so I won't speak about them further. The inclusion of leveling and stat requirements requires players to choose which 5 weapons they want to use for the whole game on any given run. Theoretically, a player could grind to level 1,000,000 to use and upgrade any weapon for New Game Plus, and some people probably have. This would require grinding though, something we will discuss later. The issue here is that RPG elements add nothing and only take things away from the player. Leveling, instead of granting players choices, which is the intention for these mechanics, is limiting them to certain weapons because of the stat requirements. A high investment in any one stat doesn't change how a Bloodborne player engages with the combat. Regardless of how much damage you do, or how much health you have, or how fast your attack animations are, your playstyle is required to be fast and aggressive. It's the different animations assigned to trick weapon modes that give players choice. There is variety in what kind of damage type the weapons do. This is built into the gem augmentation system, but this doesn't change how you use the weapon, just what the numbers attached to it mean. Your stat investment in Bloodborne does not give choices on how you can play the game. It only dictates which weapons you don't get to use. This system is a relic from Dark Souls 1 and 2 and does not accomplish the same thing. There's also no respec option in Bloodborne, meaning that if you find a weapon with stat requirements you don't meet, you have 3 criteria for using it. 1. To sink currency into meeting the stat requirements at the opportunity cost of maximizing your other stats. 2. Spending upgrade materials on the weapon to make its damage output viable for wherever you are in the game. 3. Removing your best attunement gems for whatever weapon you are already using to maximize effectiveness. Alternatively, choosing good enough gems from your store of gems depending on where you are in the game and how many usable gems you have. If you happen to find this hypothetical weapon after you've already upgraded your 5 weapons per playthrough, the new weapon will only be able to be fully upgraded for the endgame. The option to purchase final upgrade materials from a bird bath only opens up after defeating Murgo's wet nurse and costs 60 insight, which, for the uninitiated, is quite expensive. You can only have up to 99 at a time. To round off this section, we can say with certainty that the RPG mechanics in Bloodborne are holdovers from older games that don't achieve the same effect. It is not explicitly damaging to the game's combat that you don't get to use every weapon on every playthrough, because this isn't a game built around variety. But the progression feature adds nothing but more menus, removes player choice, and takes up the player's time. I can't imagine that Bloodborne wouldn't better reward experimentation without leveling or upgrading at all. Although some think of it as a spiritual sequel, I won't rely on comparison to Sekiro in this analysis, partly because it was made after Bloodborne, so that's not super fair, and also that they are different games with different intended experiences, albeit with similarities. We can look at that game to see how streamlined or omitted RPG mechanics resulted in giving every player access to all available variety, limited though it is. Bloodborne levels are mechanically just Dark Souls levels. They don't reward aggression from the player. Almost every section of Bloodborne requires careful and methodical play, reminiscent of what we saw in Dark Souls 1 and 2. The combat in Bloodborne is intended to be the opposite of careful. A player is rewarded for quickly striking back in revenge to replenish their health, while backing off and playing cautiously after being hit will consume finite healing resources. I'll talk about healing at length, but not yet. Levels in Bloodborne are loaded with traps, large enemy groups, ambushes, and fuckery. All of these situations demand slow play to survive, and so the levels in Bloodborne directly conflict with the playstyle required in combat. Nearly every enemy in the game is fought most efficiently by overwhelming them with superior damage output. Getting through every level in one piece requires caution and patience. This rhythm is present throughout the game and becomes most jarring in boss fights when, usually, caution goes out the window completely in favor of hitting the boss as fast as you can. This ever-present change in speed creates a dissonance between the levels and the boss encounters. Here's a clip from Joseph Anderson's review talking about the exact same thing.
The game wants you to be somewhat cautious in your exploration and dealing with the normal enemies, but then mouth-frothing, rage-aggressive with these bosses.
In Dark Souls, the caution and precision required to get through each section of the game is capped with a boss fight that asks the player to prove what they learned in the previous level. Bosses in Dark Souls are often mechanical continuations of the area that preceded them. The Dark Souls lineup certainly has its problems, but the most effective sections for teaching the player do work this way. For example, after 3 rooms of a melee enemy and a ranged enemy backing them up in progressing intensity, you fight the gargoyles, one of whom fights mostly melee, one of whom fights mostly ranged. After fighting down through a series of rickety platforms and floor hazards, you fight a sexy lady who covers the floor in hazards. Here's how to fight dogs. Here's how to fight dogs with ninjas. Here's how to fight dogs with a boss in between. After working your way through a castle made entirely of traps requiring careful observation of your surroundings, you fight a huge suit of armor that is very susceptible to being killed by its surroundings if the player can position it correctly. Huge multiple attackers, I think you get it. Bloodborne does not have this teaching and payoff to the same degree. Every Bloodborne level is slow. You must pay close attention to enemy patterns. You have to watch out for traps and the aforementioned fuckery. You wind your way through each section, keeping an eye out for the inevitable shortcut. Most bosses in Bloodborne are overwhelmingly fast and aggressive, and must be matched on those terms if the player is to survive. I'm not saying Bloodborne has bad levels. I'm saying that the Dark Souls style levels are directly at odds with what is expected of you in Bloodborne boss encounters. Many of the bosses in Bloodborne will activate a mechanic that puts a clock on the player to apply more pressure and finish the fight quickly. Some of these mechanics are even foreshadowed in the level before and are examples of teaching and payoff. Gascoigne in his monster mode, BSB in his poison, Shadows of Yharnam and the snakes, Ludwig in his second phase, Maria in her second and third phase, Orphan and the jumping on my fucking head. You get it. These are great mechanics for pushing a player towards speed and aggression, but it means that there is a distinct shift in how to survive a level versus how to win a boss fight. There are only 2 boss mechanics I can think of that require aggression in the prior level and the boss fight, those being BSB's poison, which is shown briefly on previous enemies before the boss, and that the poison stops when the enemy dies, and the one Reborn with how much Yargul teaches you to hunt down the Bellringers. Dark Souls level design is an effective teacher, but it only teaches Dark Souls play. Here's a clip from Hbomberguy's review, maybe inadvertently demonstrating what I mean.
Oh, I fucking see you, mate. Yeah, I've played a video game before.
You outwitted him.
Welcome to Dark Souls. That's the first trick they pull in all those games.
This is harmful to the Bloodborne combat experience, which is very different from Dark Souls and teaches Bloodborne players the wrong lessons. If you don't believe me on this point, imagine putting Old Yharnam into Dark Souls 1 or 2. Aside from the aesthetics and the speed of the enemies, it would be right at home. Now imagine trying to fight Father Gascoigne with your Dark Souls 1 or 2 moveset. It would be impossible. FromSoft took the tried and true level structure that worked for their big hit games and plugged it into Bloodborne without updating it. There are some encounters that do more directly support Bloodborne combat, although these are exceptions rather than the rule. The Frenzy Thousand Eye monsters, especially the one before the shortcut to Amygdala, you have to run at this enemy and burst it down before it builds up frenzy and kills you. Its placement requires the player to recognize the source of the frenzy and close distance quickly. This is an encounter that tests player aggression and awareness. Similarly, there are many enemy placements with a melee target close to the player and a ranged enemy forcing a choice between standing your ground or sprinting past to eliminate the ranged threat. This is testing quick decision making from the player and synchronizes with Bloodborne's heightened movement speed. But for every encounter like these, there are 5 where you must slowly bait out enemies from a group, one at a time to avoid being overwhelmed. Think of any section of the entire game. This is most of what the levels look like. The counterpoint to this that I've heard is that this is variety in gameplay, that constant aggression would not be fun, and that slower levels provide a needed break from boss fights. I would point out that I've never heard Dark Souls 1 or 2 referred to as repetitive for having boss design similar to level design. But more importantly, this whole thing is a statement of opinion. We can say that we enjoy Dark Souls level design, and I do. I even enjoy it in Bloodborne to a lesser extent. But Dark Souls levels are the same as Bloodborne levels, despite them being different intended experiences. The levels in Bloodborne conflict with its core combat philosophy instead of reinforcing it, the way they did in Dark Souls. Parrying is where we start to diverge from the idea that Dark Souls features are problems for Bloodborne. Parrying has problems all on its own. Let's be quick here, because I'm confident that if you've made it this far, you understand how the parrying works. In Dark Souls, parrying was high risk and high reward. Being close enough to parry meant that you were within striking distance of your opponent. With the right timing, a successful parry gives you a free strike on enemies with greatly increased damage. If you miss the timing, you're getting hit. This parry functions as an option for skilled players that allows them to breeze through certain fights if they have the timing. In Bloodborne, it's similar, although the balance of risk versus reward has been skewed. Because the gun has increased range to that of a shield, you can attempt to parry from outside the striking range of your opponent. With proper positioning, a parry attempt risks nothing other than a finite resource bullet. Additionally, the visceral attack can be executed more reliably than in Dark Souls because the quick-step dodge allows a player to close distance. On top of all this, the visceral attack restores all of a player's missing rally health instead of only a portion like regular attacks do. This feature can have a drastic effect on the difficulty of Bloodborne in the same way that it can for Dark Souls. I won't speak further about the perceived difficulty because it's entirely subjective. Because this game gives you a gun for free along with a brief tutorial message, it would seem like parrying is a core function of the combat. The choice to make bullets a finite resource, however, means that encounters and levels cannot have gameplay that requires bullets, because a player might not have any. Some fights do have optional bullet counterplay, Martyr Ligarius for example, but they are never required to progress. Bullets being a consumable could be viewed as an attempt to balance the system, providing a drawback for using such a potent tool. The gun parrying has the potential to induce a passive playstyle, encouraging players to wait for a predictable attack animation to execute a visceral instead of applying pressure with a melee weapon, breaking the intended experience. Since I didn't develop this game, I can't say definitively if this system is working as intended, but we can say that while it rewards a player's precision and memorization of attack patterns, it doesn't encourage player aggression on its own. A mechanic that bridged this gap and taught both lessons would harmonize better with Bloodborne's combat. Suggested changes to this mechanic tend to be centered on balance and giving the parrying more significant downsides. While in my opinion those suggestions do make sense, that isn't the subject of this video. Because I am attempting to be objective in this analysis, it may sound like all the problems in Bloodborne are created equal. They are not. Parrying has the potential to nullify aggression against humanoid opponents, but it is also a reward for learning a fight thoroughly. Arcane magic has the same potential problem, but in both instances, a player is exploiting an offensive option that is not required to progress through the game. This analysis is not about how difficult or easy Bloodborne is perceived to be, only how the mechanics enforce or detract from the intended experience. On those terms, parrying and magic are only imperfect systems. Blood vials are a far more pervasive problem that contradicts the rally system and may even force a player to grind. Before we talk about the healing systems in Bloodborne, it might be more efficient to first talk about grinding. Grinding is not inherently bad. Some entire games are built around it. Games like World of Warcraft or Farmville have entire gameplay loops built around completing repetitive tasks for resources to enhance other aspects of the gameplay. Action games do not generally fall into this category, and Bloodborne is an action game with RPG elements, not the other way around. I know this and the following section are going to be the most contentious parts of the video, so here's an olive branch. If you like grinding in Bloodborne, or simply don't find it to be an issue, that's fine. I'm not saying you're wrong for liking it. Depending on how much you personally enjoy the combat and the loading screen art, it might be your favorite part of the game, and who am I to tell you that's wrong? However, it cannot be argued that grinding for blood echoes or vials doesn't take up the player's time that could otherwise be spent playing through the story of the game. I will go a step further to say that grinding can destroy the flow of any action game, and replaying levels or sections for a currency should be considered very carefully by the developer depending on the desired player experience. As an example, imagine if Doom Eternal required you to replay the early levels multiple times to avoid being one-shot by imps in the late game. Imagine if the upgrades in God of War Ragnarok couldn't be purchased with the amount of currency obtained by playing through the story. What would it do to the flow of that game to require grinding previous sections just to survive? The presence of grinding is a questionable inclusion to any action title. It has the potential to take the action out of action game. Your personal mileage with grinding features will likely hinge on how long it takes to engage with, and to what degree story progress has been disrupted. In Bloodborne, there is no resting at checkpoints to reset the world state or enemies. This can only be done by warping and then awakening at checkpoints. Whenever you want to farm a section for currency or vials, you kill the enemies, return to the lamp, warp to the Hunter's Dream, because remember, you can't warp between the lamps, contribute to your blood IRA, warp back to your preferred farming section to resume a grind. The other strategy is to run longer sections or entire levels before returning to a lamp. Since you can't warp from anywhere, this increases the time spent running to and from checkpoints, as well as the danger of you getting killed along the way. This method has its own pros and cons, but it requires the same amount of warping. If you weren't aware that grinding could be present in Bloodborne, or think that I'm inflating its prevalence, let's talk briefly about how the healing used to work in Dark Souls and how they changed it. In Dark Souls, healing is achieved via the Estus Flask, a resource that replenishes infinitely up to a certain number of uses, primarily by resting at a checkpoint. Because the runs from a checkpoint to a boss fight nearly always have hazards or enemies in between, the rhythm of Dark Souls is to become so proficient at each section of the game as to maximize your available healing for boss fights at the end. In Dark Souls 2, this system was updated to include consumable healing resources as well. Some have argued those consumables nullified the proficiency required by Estus, and by extension the core experience of Dark Souls. Not everyone agrees with this take. Regardless of how we feel about Dark Souls 2, we can all agree that Estus on its own requires players to be proficient at the sections between checkpoints and bosses if they want to maximize their available healing. This mechanic is built around the checkpoint to boss fight structure of Dark Souls, and it rewards cautious play. The hot new Bloodborne healing is only consumables, but lots of them. Blood vials restore 40% of your max health when consumed, or injected. They are refilled up to your equipable maximum after warping and awakening at checkpoints. This carry limit is at least 20 and all the way up to 32 depending on your equipped runes. The catch is, these vials, unlike Estus, are finite. Estus will refill all the way every time you rest at a checkpoint or warp somewhere. Vials draw from your inventory in the Hunter's Dream that goes all the way up to 600, but it is possible to run out. If you awaken in a level and find that you have less than 20 vials equipped, guess what? Your stores of healing resources are completely depleted. The Estus system teaches players to be cautious, and it would have done the same for Bloodborne. The blood vial system is, in many ways, more forgiving. Vials drop often from regular enemies and can be purchased in the Hunter's Dream for a small price that scales with your story progression. On paper, this sounds like a system that rewards players for fighting more of the enemies in a given level to maximize your healing for the boss fight, which is a reward for aggression. In practice, this can result in grinding. More than anything I've said in this video, this point is the one most likely to bring up the tried and true counter to any critique of FromSoft game design, which is skill issue. I won't say the healing system requires grinding, because if you first try your way through the game and maintain certain spending habits, it likely will not. Grinding for currency to buy more healing, bullets, levels, upgrades, chalice dungeons, and repairs could result in grinding for players who fall behind the power curve of the game. If this were a review of the whole game and its quality, it would be worth examining how likely it is to fall behind that power curve, and then skill issue would be a more reasonable consideration. But it's not. We're examining the Blood Vials mechanic to see how it has the potential to negatively affect the intended player experience, not how likely it is that you personally would interact with it in this way. It's really not that complex. You can run out of vials. This requires grinding for vials or currency to purchase more vials. Grinding is counter to the player experience of action games and to Bloodborne. Depending on player ability, this could result in a vicious cycle of dying to a boss, leaving a farm, buying and collecting vials, and attempting the boss again. In comparison, the benefit of Estus is that while a player might want to grind for levels or upgrades, attempts at bosses are free from permanent consequence, meaning anything can be attempted any number of times with a guaranteed amount of healing. Some refer to this as the banging your head against a wall approach. Dark Souls 2 punishes death by cutting player health in half, but once your health is at half, it can't start lower, so at least it's consistent, although this has a similar problem because the resource to restore the full health is also finite. The conflict in Bloodborne's healing design is that blood vials are effective and plentiful, but it would seem like you aren't supposed to rely on them. The game rewards hit trading and replenishing your health with rallying. On the other hand, blood vials restore 40% of your max health and you start able to carry 20. In the way that your healing is a measure of your allotted mistakes in a game, this is room for up to 32 mistakes in the late game. In Dark Souls, this number only ever gets as high as 20 if you kindle certain bonfires, none of which are near area bosses. Maybe it isn't clear just from the words I'm saying, but compared to Estus, blood vials are very potent. They activate quickly, they heal a flat percentage instead of an amount of health, meaning they scale no matter your stat investment. They drop from enemies, and they can be purchased for a relatively small amount of currency. So which is it? Does the game want a player to rely on vials, or to rely on rallying? The finite nature of vials would indicate to lean on rallying. The potency of the vials and the base number allotted to you would say to rely on vials. You start the game able to make 20 mistakes if your healing stock is full. For comparison, the Estus Flask, in a game intended to make you cautious, starts with only 5 uses in Dark Souls 1, and only 1 in Dark Souls 2. The amount of vials you can carry and how effective they are encourages players to back off and heal often, but the rally system encourages charging in and recklessly trading blows. This system is at odds with itself. Maybe the rallying needed to be better, maybe blood vials needed to be worse or less plentiful. Regardless, the existing healing in Bloodborne teaches the player conflicting lessons about how the game is meant to be played, with the possible downside of grinding in an action game. I am now going to argue against some of the most common defenses for this system. I'm not looking for straw men here, but these are the most popular versions of why people seem to think the blood vial system isn't a flaw. If you look up Bloodborne Reddit and search for blood vials, you will find hundreds of posts from new players complaining about the functionality of blood vials, with comment sections shouting them down or telling them that they're playing the game wrong. So, Number 1. Skill issue. Yes, grinding can be negated by being good at the game. But so can the healing system, so can dodging, so can the frame rate, so can the loading times, so can the RPG mechanics. If I power through the entire game on my first try and never take damage, there are many features I will never interact with. I don't find skill issue to be a strong defense for any system. It's the other side of the coin from fun as a reason to like or dislike something. We can feel however we want to about these systems, and I'm not here to tell you you're wrong. But it can't be argued that Bloodborne will never require grinding by anybody. This is the same argument that makes people say that Dark Souls is too punishing. And it's the same argument that makes people say it's too easy. This is entirely subjective, and it isn't a fair metric to assess how a game mechanic can affect gameplay. 2. It's good, actually. Some will defend the vial system because it's in a game they love. We don't have to do this. We can love something and still recognize that a part of it is flawed. Recognizing that vials and rallying promote opposite playstyles doesn't make the game bad, but they are still conflicting design choices. It's absolutely a valid opinion to enjoy the healing, but once we find ourselves saying a system is perfect, in spite of its flaws, then the rose-colored glasses are all the way on, and we're no longer attempting objectivity.
I feel like Bloodborne might have perfected the system by giving you a lot of a finite amount of thing. However, it is possible to run out and have to farm for them, which isn't so great. I feel like Bloodborne might have perfected the system, but you can theoretically run out. I feel like Bloodborne might have perfected the system. I also think the Blood Vial system, while good and fun, has the inherent downsides of if you run out, you can't easily buy more because they're just a bit too expensive per vial, and if you're at an area or boss that kills you a lot, you're not going to be recovering them from enemies, so you inevitably have to go farm vials or the souls to buy them, and that's just not great when it happens. I feel like Bloodborne might have perfected the system.
In the interest of arguing in good faith, I think MrTommoTalksGames means that the vial system bridges the gap between the cautious healing of the Estus Flask and the potency of DS2 consumables,
and that he really likes what this does for Bloodborne.
These statements do not disprove contradictions in design, but they do clarify MrTommoTalksGames' statements as opinions. I'm not trying to be a dick, just to make clear the difference between liking a mechanic and assessing its potential effects on gameplay. 3. It can be negated by certain tactics. The defense for healing that I see most often is that if you kill all the enemies in a level and always spend your excess currency on vials in the dream, then you should never really run out of them anyway, right? So it's a non-issue, case closed. This point is, again, entirely dependent on player skill. If I suck at the game, hypothetically of course, then I can run out of my stockpile of healing, so I will have to farm to get more attempts at bosses or sections with vials available. This is the same defense as skill issue, but the real problem with this argument is, if finite heals are a non-issue, then why are they finite at all? Logic like this asserts that if a feature can be negated by playing a certain way, then that feature doesn't matter. This same logic can be applied to any feature in the game to the same effect. Don't like rallying? Simply never take damage. Don't like parrying? Simply don't do it. Don't like loading screens? Simply beat the entire game in one unbroken attempt and never warp anywhere. This reasoning attempts to negate flaws by stating that they don't affect the game if you do certain things, that the feature is fluff that you shouldn't care about, that it adds nothing but only has unlikely downsides. Like weapon durability, if you just do a little bit of housekeeping, you shouldn't ever need to think about it. YouTuber Smabbott made a video where he's very unkind to this game, but he sums this idea up as:
a seasoned player will not find this a large problem, as they can manage their vials without needing to farm due to their skill with the game, circumventing, once again, a key mechanic of the experience. Yeah, that doesn't make it a good mechanic.
This whole line of thinking is also an extension of the "it's good actually" point. There's no logic here, just pretending a flaw isn't a flaw because it's in a game we really like. A feature that requires counterplay to prevent it becoming a factor does not negate the existence of the feature, and does not mean that it won't become a factor for some players. Like the omnipresence of your inevitable death, forgetting about it does not make it go away. Arguments to downplay the significance of finite vials usually assert that using the rally system near exclusively is the best way to play, and that its existence discourages usage of the vials by the player. But do you know what would emphasize the rally system even more? If there were no vials at all. So we have to ask ourselves, what is the intent with the healing system, and do these mechanics achieve that? Blood vials do not reward aggression. They encourage safe play because they're so much more efficient and safe than rallying. Charging into rally health pack is risky. Backing up to heal is much safer. Rallying is a genius mechanic that anchors Bloodborne's combat, but it's undermined by the existence of a potent and plentiful healing with grindy downsides. To examine mechanical effectiveness, it is vital that we attempt to measure the impact of the mechanics objectively. If we start making exceptions for gameplay from a viewpoint of personal enjoyment, we can quickly find ourselves in a line of thinking that culminates in the sentiment that all art is completely subjective, and how can we even begin to discuss its quality? This is not the case for any art, but there must be stated conditions so that our opinions don't overcome the analysis. In the discussion around the mechanics of Bloodborne, I will often see statements to the effect of, well, the ROM fight is supposed to be slow, and by that criteria, it's good. So by changing our analytical criteria as we go, we run the risk of excusing any potential problems because we enjoy the final product. Through a shifting lens, any art can be construed as perfect. This is the same thinking that leads some in the community to excuse mechanically shallow encounters for lore or spectacle. If lore and spectacle are metrics that are being used to value the game, then those are valid points. In a critical conversation about games, a discussion about mechanics is often derailed when contending with mechanics that don't fit the established narrative surrounding the game. An unpopular game will have its successes diminished, and a popular game will see its shortcomings ignored. This is just par for the course when an art has many people discussing it, but this video is my attempt to start a conversation about mechanical effectiveness without relying on subjective taste or experience. I've said it here several times, and I will likely have to explain it to some Reddit mods at gunpoint someday, but I'm not saying that these are bad systems, or that the game is bad, or anything like that. In this whole boring-ass analysis, I only talked about 3.5 problems. That's a pretty strong track record for an entire game. There are way more problems in Dark Souls 1 or 2 and Elden Ring, but that's a story for another time. Bloodborne is a triumph among action games, a revelation in atmosphere and visual storytelling, and one of the most uniquely barbaric gaming experiences ever made. The game also has RPG mechanics that waste the player's time and lock them out of experimentation, levels that conflict with the play required in boss fights, and healing that can't make up its mind about what it wants to be. As gamers of unrivaled passion, it can be difficult to hold all these beliefs simultaneously, and I understand that not everyone will agree with these points. I don't take that personally. My hope for this video is to start an honest discussion about this and other games, built around the mutual acknowledgement that constructive critique encourages our favorite art to grow, and ignoring its problems allows it to stagnate. It happened to Bethesda, it happened to Pokemon, it happened to Infinity Ward, it happened to Ubisoft, and I don't want to see it happen to From Software. Obviously, my channel is fairly young, and I have never attempted any form of game analysis before. Feedback on the quality of my writing and construction of my analysis is appreciated. Thank you.